In December 1944, as snow buried the forests of the Ardennes and the Western Front, convulsed under the weight of Germany's final gamble, Allied commanders faced a crisis that went far beyond maps and troop movements. The German offensive threatened supply lines, shattered communications, and placed entire American divisions at risk of encirclement. For Dwight Eisenhower, the overriding priority was survival of the coalition itself. For Bernard Montgomery, it was a moment that forced long-suppressed judgments into sharp relief. Montgomery did not speak openly about George S. Patton during this crisis. He never publicly labeled him reckless or dangerous. He did not question his courage or competence in official statements. Instead, Montgomery maintained the posture he had cultivated throughout the war: calm, professional, restrained. Yet behind that restraint lay a set of conclusions he never articulated in public. Conclusions shaped by years of observing Patton's methods and the effect those methods had on the alliance. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. To understand what Montgomery really thought of Patton, it is necessary to strip away the caricatures that developed after the war. Patton was not merely an impulsive cavalryman charging ahead without regard for consequence. Montgomery was not simply a plodding bureaucrat afraid of bold action. Both men were products of distinct military traditions, shaped by different wars, different political environments, and different understandings of responsibility. Montgomery's formative experience was the First World War, where poorly coordinated offensives had produced catastrophic casualties for marginal gains. He emerged from that conflict convinced that discipline, preparation, and overwhelming force were moral imperatives. In his view, a commander's first duty was not speed or spectacle, but preservation of combat power and alliance cohesion. War, he believed, punished impatience more severely than caution. Patton's formative experiences were different. He had watched wars stagnate when commanders hesitated. He believed that enemies recovered faster than planners anticipated. To Patton, momentum was not recklessness. It was a weapon. The longer an opponent was allowed to regroup, the more expensive victory became. Speed, in his mind, saved lives in the long run by preventing prolonged resistance. These philosophies did not merely coexist within the Allied command. They competed. By the time Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, the contrast between the two men had become impossible to ignore. Patton advanced at a pace that stunned both German defenders and Allied planners. Entire formations collapsed under the pressure. Towns and cities fell in rapid succession. German commanders found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. Montgomery watched these developments with professional interest and growing unease. He did not deny Patton's effectiveness. Privately, he acknowledged that the advances were impressive. What concerned him was not whether Patton could move quickly, but what that speed implied for the structure of Allied command. Patton's success created pressure. It raised expectations that could not always be met. It encouraged comparisons between commanders that threatened the delicate political balance of the alliance. British leaders already feared that Britain's role in the war was being eclipsed by American industrial and manpower advantages. A highly visible American general, celebrated for his independence and aggression, intensified those fears. Montgomery understood that wars were not won solely on battlefields. They were won in negotiations, conferences, and public perception. Authority in a coalition depended as much on narrative as on results. Patton's narrative was simple and compelling. He moved fast. He attacked relentlessly. He appeared decisive. Montgomery's narrative was more complex. He emphasized planning, coordination, and restraint. These qualities mattered deeply to him, but they did not translate easily into headlines. This disparity shaped what Montgomery thought of Patton. He did not see him as reckless in the childish sense. He saw him as destabilizing. Patton's independence threatened to shift authority away from institutions and toward personalities. That shift, Montgomery believed, could fracture alliances just as surely as military defeat. When the German Ardennes offensive erupted in mid-December 1944, these concerns became immediate. The German breakthrough severed communications and forced Eisenhower to make rapid decisions about command arrangements. To restore coherence in the north, Eisenhower temporarily placed American forces there under Montgomery's command. Montgomery accepted the responsibility and moved quickly to stabilize the situation. He reorganized defenses, prioritized holding key terrain, and ensured that British forces were not drawn into unnecessary risks. From his perspective, he was doing exactly what the moment required. South of the German penetration, Patton acted differently. He pivoted his Third Army northward with remarkable speed, executing a maneuver that required extraordinary staff work and logistical improvisation. Within days, his forces were attacking toward Bastogne, relieving the encircled garrison and applying pressure that German commanders had not anticipated. Montgomery did not publicly criticize this action. He praised coordination and emphasized collective effort. Privately, however, the episode reinforced his underlying judgment. Patton acted without waiting for consensus. He did not seek expanded authority or political cover. He simply moved. This was what Montgomery found most troubling. Patton's approach worked. It delivered results before formal structures could respond. It demonstrated that decisive action could reshape situations faster than committees and plans. In moments of crisis, Patton did not need to persuade. He created facts on the ground. Montgomery understood the power of such facts. He also understood their danger. If commanders learned that boldness alone could generate authority, then restraint would be penalized. Caution would appear weakness. Planning would seem unnecessary. Over time, this dynamic could erode the very systems that allowed coalitions to function. Montgomery never said this publicly. To do so would have been to admit fear. Not fear of Patton as a man, but fear of what Patton represented. A future in which control yielded to momentum, and institutional authority yielded to individual initiative. The press conference of January 7, 1945, revealed how deeply these tensions ran. Montgomery spoke as if he had directed the entire Allied response to the Bulge. He emphasized method and coordination. He minimized the role of American commanders, including Patton. To Montgomery, this was an assertion of order. To Americans, it sounded like appropriation. The backlash was immediate. Omar Bradley contemplated resignation. Eisenhower was forced into urgent damage control. Winston Churchill intervened to prevent a diplomatic rupture between allies. Montgomery was stunned by the reaction. He believed he had spoken truthfully. He did not grasp how his words would be received by commanders who had endured the initial shock of the offensive and then watched Patton drive north under brutal conditions. What Montgomery failed to see was that his attempt to control the narrative had confirmed American suspicions. It reinforced the belief that he did not trust Patton's style of warfare and feared its implications. From that moment forward, Montgomery's influence over American forces narrowed. Eisenhower retained him in command, but ensured that future arrangements limited his political exposure. Patton continued advancing under tighter constraints of his own. After the war, Montgomery never openly reassessed Patton. In his memoirs, he acknowledged Patton's competence but questioned his judgment. He emphasized discipline over dash. He framed success as institutional rather than personal. Patton, who died in December 1945, became legend. This outcome deepened the contrast Montgomery had always feared. History rewarded spectacle more generously than restraint. Patton's image grew with time. Montgomery's influence faded. Yet Montgomery never said what he truly believed. He never admitted that Patton's style worked precisely because it defied control. He never acknowledged that speed and initiative had reshaped modern warfare in ways his own methods struggled to match. He never conceded that his authority depended on systems Patton routinely bypassed. Instead, Montgomery clung to professionalism as armor. He presented himself as the responsible adult, the guardian against chaos, the commander who understood the political consequences of failure. Behind that posture lay an unspoken recognition. Patton was dangerous not because he was reckless, but because he was effective in ways that undermined the logic of centralized control. He showed that in modern war, momentum could outrun planning, that initiative could override hierarchy, that success itself could generate authority. Montgomery understood this, and that is why he never said it publicly. Fear, once acknowledged, loses its usefulness. Montgomery chose silence instead. But history has a way of revealing what leaders try to conceal. It records patterns of resistance, moments of tension, and choices made under pressure. In the final year of the war, Montgomery's actions spoke clearly. His resistance to resource reallocation, his discomfort with Patton's independence, his insistence on controlling narrative as much as operations. Together, they reveal what Montgomery really thought of Patton, not admiration, not disdain, recognition. Montgomery's judgment of Patton did not exist in isolation. It was reinforced by how Patton's presence altered behavior across the Allied command. Meetings changed when Patton entered the room. Assumptions shifted when his armies were nearby. Plans that might have seemed adequate on paper suddenly felt conservative when measured against what Patton had already achieved. This was particularly evident in the period following the Normandy breakout. Allied planners had expected a difficult, incremental advance across France, slowed by logistics, terrain, and German resistance. Patton disrupted those expectations almost immediately. His forces advanced faster than supply depots could be established. Fuel shortages became chronic. Communications lagged behind movement. And yet, German defenses continued to collapse. To Montgomery, this created a paradox. Patton was operating beyond the limits Montgomery believed prudent, yet he was succeeding. That success forced difficult questions. Were the limits themselves outdated? Was caution becoming an obstacle rather than a safeguard? Or was Patton merely benefiting from temporary conditions that would soon expose the fragility of his approach? Montgomery leaned toward the latter explanation. He believed Patton's advances were impressive but unsustainable. He expected that logistics, resistance, or political intervention would eventually force Patton to slow. This belief allowed Montgomery to maintain confidence in his own philosophy without conceding ground. But time did not immediately vindicate that expectation. Throughout August and early September 1944, Patton continued to exploit opportunities faster than Allied command structures could adapt. German units retreated in disarray. Entire formations dissolved under pressure. The speed of the advance prevented coherent German countermeasures. Patton's army did not merely advance. It destabilized the enemy's ability to think. Montgomery observed this with increasing concern. He did not dispute that Patton was achieving results. What troubled him was how those results were achieved. They depended on decentralization, improvisation, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. These were qualities Montgomery distrusted, especially in a coalition where missteps carried political consequences. Montgomery's experience had taught him that failures were remembered longer than successes. A single catastrophic defeat could overshadow months of steady progress. Britain, unlike the United States, could not absorb unlimited losses. Its manpower pool was smaller. Its political tolerance for disaster was lower. Montgomery believed his caution reflected those realities. Patton did not operate under the same constraints. American resources appeared inexhaustible by comparison. American public opinion celebrated boldness. Patton's willingness to push boundaries resonated with that environment. Montgomery feared that this difference in tolerance for risk would fracture alliance decision-making. This fear shaped how Montgomery responded to Patton's growing influence. He did not challenge Patton directly. Instead, he reinforced processes that diluted individual authority. He emphasized committee decisions. He advocated broad-front advances that distributed momentum rather than concentrating it. He supported Eisenhower's instinct to balance competing pressures rather than favor one commander decisively. These positions were framed as strategic judgments, but they also served a political purpose. They ensured that no single commander, particularly an American one, could dominate the narrative of victory. Patton sensed this resistance. He interpreted it as obstruction. He believed Montgomery was deliberately slowing operations to preserve British prestige. Whether that interpretation was fair mattered less than its effect. It hardened Patton's distrust of Montgomery and reinforced his tendency to act first and justify later. The result was an unspoken competition. Patton sought to demonstrate that speed produced results. Montgomery sought to demonstrate that order preserved stability. Each success by one validated the fears of the other. This dynamic became especially clear during debates over strategic direction in the autumn of 1944. With Germany reeling, Allied leaders faced a choice. Should they concentrate resources for a rapid thrust toward the Ruhr, exploiting German weakness, or should they maintain a balanced advance to prevent overextension and political imbalance? Patton argued forcefully for concentration. He believed Germany was near collapse, and that decisive pressure could end the war quickly. Montgomery proposed his own concentrated operation in the north, one that would preserve British influence while promising dramatic results. Eisenhower's response was cautious. He attempted to accommodate both visions without fully committing to either. Resources were divided. Momentum was diluted. Both Patton and Montgomery felt constrained. When Montgomery's northern thrust failed to achieve its objectives, American commanders viewed it as confirmation of their doubts. To them, it illustrated the risks of prioritizing political balance over operational opportunity. Montgomery viewed the criticism as short-sighted. He believed it ignored the dangers Patton's approach posed to alliance cohesion. This mutual frustration deepened mistrust. Montgomery's view of Patton hardened during this period. He no longer saw him simply as a talented subordinate. He saw him as a destabilizing force whose success undermined the principles Montgomery believed necessary for coalition warfare. Patton's independence threatened to erode respect for centralized authority. His public persona threatened to overshadow collective effort. Montgomery never articulated this judgment openly. To do so would have appeared petty or defensive. Instead, he expressed his concerns obliquely, through emphasis on process, discipline, and coordination. Patton dismissed these concerns as excuses. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted, the rivalry took on a sharper edge. The German offensive exposed vulnerabilities in Allied defenses and forced rapid decision-making. Eisenhower's decision to grant Montgomery temporary authority over American units in the North was driven by necessity, not preference. He needed clarity and coherence. Montgomery believed the decision validated his approach. He reorganized defenses carefully, prioritized stabilization, and avoided unnecessary risks. From his perspective, he was fulfilling his duty to preserve the alliance under extreme pressure. Patton's response highlighted the contrast. Rather than focus solely on containment, he sought decisive action. His rapid pivot toward Bastogne was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a demonstration of his philosophy under the most adverse conditions. Montgomery watched this unfold with mixed emotions. He recognized the brilliance of the maneuver. He also recognized its implications. Patton's success reinforced the perception that speed and initiative were decisive. It weakened the case for restraint. This tension reached its peak in the aftermath of the battle. Montgomery's press conference was not intended as an insult. It was an attempt to assert order over chaos, to frame the crisis as a managed event rather than a near catastrophe. He emphasized coordination and method because those were the values he believed had prevented disaster. The American reaction revealed how deeply Patton's influence had penetrated the command culture. To American generals, Montgomery's language seemed to dismiss the sacrifices and initiative that had turned the tide. It confirmed their belief that Montgomery did not respect their approach. Eisenhower intervened decisively. He understood that Montgomery's behavior, regardless of intent, threatened alliance unity. He curtailed Montgomery's authority over American forces and centralized decision-making. For Montgomery, this was a turning point. He remained a senior commander, but his influence over the direction of the campaign diminished. He recognized that Eisenhower no longer trusted him to manage American sensitivities. This realization reinforced his underlying judgment about Patton. Patton's presence had changed the balance of authority. Montgomery did not respond with open hostility. He adjusted. He focused on his sector. He emphasized professionalism. He avoided public confrontation. After the war, this adjustment became his dominant theme. In his memoirs and speeches, Montgomery framed the campaign as a triumph of planning and coordination. He acknowledged Patton's competence but emphasized the dangers of impulsiveness. He portrayed himself as a stabilizing force rather than a rival. This portrayal was incomplete, but it was deliberate. Montgomery understood how history was written. He knew that public narratives solidified into institutional memory. By emphasizing collective effort, he sought to prevent the war from being remembered as the triumph of a few flamboyant individuals. Patton's death ensured that this effort would be only partially successful. Without his own memoirs to shape interpretation, Patton became a symbol molded by others. His image grew larger with time. His reputation hardened into legend. Montgomery observed this development with quiet frustration. The very outcome he had feared was taking shape. Patton's style was being celebrated. His own emphasis on control was receding into the background. Yet Montgomery never corrected the record directly. He never publicly admitted that Patton's approach had been effective in ways that challenged his own beliefs. To do so would have been to concede that modern war favored momentum over method. Instead, Montgomery remained consistent. He defended his record. He emphasized the costs of recklessness. He trusted that sober analysis would eventually prevail. But among American commanders, the memory was fixed. They remembered Montgomery as the general who slowed momentum, resisted initiative, and claimed credit too readily. They believed he feared Patton because Patton exposed the limitations of centralized control. Montgomery never denied this interpretation explicitly, he simply refused to engage it. Fear for Montgomery was not an emotion to be confessed, it was a factor to be managed. He believed acknowledging it would weaken authority. Silence, in his view, preserved control. As the war moved into its final months, the rivalry receded from operational relevance. Eisenhower ensured that neither Montgomery nor Patton could dominate the campaign. Balance replaced competition. But the intellectual divide remained. Montgomery continued to believe that restraint had saved lives and preserved unity. Patton's supporters continued to believe that speed had shortened the war and prevented greater suffering. Both positions contained truth. What Montgomery really thought of Patton was shaped by this complexity. He did not despise him. He did not dismiss his talent. He recognized his effectiveness. What he feared was what that effectiveness implied. Patton demonstrated that authority could flow from action rather than hierarchy, that success could outpace control, that modern war rewarded those who moved faster than systems designed to restrain them. Montgomery understood this clearly, and because he understood it, he never said it publicly. The silence was not ignorance, it was strategy. By early 1945, the rivalry between Bernard Montgomery and George Patton no longer shaped daily operations, but its consequences were already embedded in the Allied command structure. Eisenhower had adjusted the system to contain both men. Authority was centralized, boundaries were clarified, the risk that personality might fracture the alliance had been reduced. For Montgomery, this adjustment confirmed what he had long suspected. The modern coalition did not reward singular dominance. It rewarded balance, restraint, and political sensitivity. The very fact that Eisenhower had intervened to limit the influence of both Montgomery and Patton reinforced Montgomery's belief that unchecked momentum was dangerous. Yet it also confirmed something more troubling. Patton had forced that adjustment through action rather than argument. His presence had reshaped the system without his ever needing to articulate a theory of coalition warfare. He had demonstrated repeatedly that battlefield success could compel institutional change faster than negotiation or persuasion. Montgomery understood that lesson clearly. What he never admitted publicly was not that Patton was reckless, but that Patton was effective in ways Montgomery could not fully control. Patton did not merely win battles. He altered expectations. He changed what commanders believed was possible. And once expectations shifted, authority followed. This realization sat uncomfortably with Montgomery's view of leadership. He believed command should flow from structure, experience, and deliberate preparation. Patton suggested another model, one where initiative created legitimacy and speed generated authority. Montgomery never accepted that model, but he could not ignore it. After the war, Montgomery's public posture remained consistent. In speeches and memoirs, he emphasized planning, discipline, and collective effort. He framed victory as the product of institutional competence rather than individual brilliance. When Patton appeared in his accounts, it was as a capable but impulsive subordinate, valuable within limits but dangerous without restraint. This portrayal was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete. What Montgomery omitted was the degree to which Patton had unsettled him, not emotionally, but intellectually. Patton challenged Montgomery's assumptions about how wars were won and how authority should be exercised. He demonstrated that a commander could operate at the edge of control and still succeed. Montgomery had spent his career preventing that kind of uncertainty. The silence was deliberate. To admit that Patton's approach had been decisive in moments that mattered would have required Montgomery to acknowledge that caution alone was insufficient. It would have meant conceding that the war had rewarded risk in ways he had always warned against. In a post-war environment where reputations hardened into doctrine, such an admission would have weakened the legacy Montgomery sought to protect. Instead, he allowed the contrast to stand without explanation. American generals filled the gap. Among those who had served through Normandy, the fuel crisis, the Bulge, and the final drive into Germany, a consensus formed. They believed Montgomery had never truly respected Patton's approach because he feared its implications. Not fear of Patton as a man, but fear of what Patton represented. Patton represented a future in which centralized control yielded to tempo, in which commanders acted first and justified later, in which coalition politics struggled to keep pace with battlefield momentum. For American officers, this future felt inevitable. the scale of American power, the flexibility of American logistics, and the willingness of American commanders to accept risk all pointed in that direction. Patton was not an aberration. He was a preview. Montgomery understood this earlier than most. His resistance to Patton was not reactionary. It was anticipatory. He saw how quickly influence shifted toward those who delivered results fastest. He recognized that Britain, with its limited manpower and political constraints, could not compete on those terms indefinitely. This awareness shaped his behavior throughout the final year of the war. His insistence on broad front advances, his resistance to concentrating resources under a single American commander, his emphasis on coalition balance were all expressions of that concern. To American eyes, these actions looked obstructive. To Montgomery, they were defensive. Neither interpretation was entirely wrong. Eisenhower's role was to manage this tension without allowing it to escalate into rupture. His success lay not in choosing between Montgomery and Patton, but in ensuring that neither could redefine the alliance unilaterally. He limited Patton's freedom when it threatened political stability. He limited Montgomery's authority when it threatened trust. In doing so, he preserved the coalition at the cost of satisfying either man fully. That compromise shaped the end of the war. Patton continued to advance aggressively, but within tighter constraints. Montgomery continued to command methodically, but without the influence he once sought over American forces. The campaign moved forward through a combination of pressure and patience. Germany collapsed not because one philosophy triumphed, but because neither was allowed to dominate unchecked. After the guns fell silent, the rivalry faded from immediate relevance, but not from memory. Patton's death in December 1945 froze his image in time. He became a symbol of aggression, confidence, and relentless movement. His flaws were acknowledged, but his successes were amplified. He never had the chance to explain himself fully, but he did not need to. His legend spoke for him. Montgomery lived on, writing, speaking, and defending his record. He remained convinced that his approach had saved lives and preserved unity. He saw himself as a necessary counterweight to excess. History was less kind. As the decades passed, narratives simplified. Patton became the embodiment of offensive spirit. Montgomery became the symbol of caution and control. The complexity of their interaction was often reduced to caricature. What was lost in that simplification was the truth that Montgomery understood Patton better than most. He did not underestimate him. He did not dismiss him. He recognized his effectiveness and its consequences. That recognition was precisely why he never spoke it aloud. Admitting that Patton's style had reshaped the war would have meant admitting that leadership itself was changing. That authority no longer flowed exclusively from preparation and hierarchy. That speed and initiative could outrun control. For a commander whose identity was built on mastery of control, this was not a concession he could make. Montgomery chose silence because silence preserved legitimacy. He allowed Americans to celebrate Patton. He allowed British audiences to remember his steadiness. He allowed the alliance's victory to stand without reopening wounds. But the underlying tension remained, embedded in how the war was remembered on opposite sides of the Atlantic. American generals never forgave Montgomery because they believed he failed to acknowledge the role Patton played in forcing Germany's defeat. Montgomery never sought forgiveness because he believed acknowledgement would validate a model of war he distrusted. Both positions reflected fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing relevance, fear of losing the ability to shape outcomes through method rather than momentum. The alliance succeeded because those fears were contained rather than indulged. Eisenhower ensured that neither Montgomery's caution nor Patton's aggression could fracture the system. He absorbed the pressure, enforced boundaries, and maintained balance. That balance ended the war. What Montgomery really thought of Patton was not contempt or envy, it was recognition. He recognized that Patton represented a force modern armies would have to reckon with, a style of command that moved faster than committees, that created facts on the ground before debates could conclude, and that derived authority from action rather than position. Montgomery never said this publicly, because to say it would have been to admit that the world he understood was already shifting. Instead, he defended the principles that had carried him to prominence. He emphasized discipline, coordination, and restraint. He trusted that history would value stability over spectacle. History valued both. The Second World War was won by armies that combined Patton's momentum with Montgomery's caution, held together by Eisenhower's restraint. Remove any one of those elements, and the alliance might have fractured. That is why the rivalry mattered. Not because it was personal, but because it revealed how fragile coalitions can be when competing visions of leadership collide. It showed how fear, unspoken but understood, can shape decisions at the highest level. Montgomery never admitted what he truly thought of Patton because admitting it would have weakened the structure he believed had preserved the alliance. Patton never softened his approach because he believed hesitation cost lives. Eisenhower ensured neither belief became absolute. Victory emerged from that tension. And in that sense, the silence Montgomery maintained was not denial, it was strategy. The war ended not with a single philosophy triumphant, but with a balance enforced by leaders who understood that coalition warfare demands restraint as much as brilliance. That is why Montgomery never said publicly what he truly thought of Patton, and that is why their rivalry still matters today. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories from the hidden power struggles that shaped history, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.